I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Sabrina. I'm going to be emceeing, if you will, this webinar. And I'll start off with some introductions. I can pass it over to Adam to introduce himself first.
Hey, I am in the product team here at Prolific, and a little bit later in the webinar, I'm going to be taking you through a demo of AI Task Builder and using Prolific to find human evaluators. And I'll pass over to Enzo to give you a bit of an intro to himself.
Hi, I'm Enzo. I support data and research at Prolific, and I'll first speak a bit about why human data is needed or human feedback is needed in developing AI applications, and what are some sort of pitfalls, but also some of the best practices you can look out for before we go to Adam with the demo of our task builder. For those unfamiliar, Prolific is a platform connecting researchers with diverse participants for studies or data collection tasks, like annotation, labeling, you name it. It can produce a very high quality human feedback at scale, also at very quick turnaround times. We have over 200,000 verified people across 37 different countries that cover both the general population for very diverse types of inputs, but at the same time, we also maintain very specialized pools of AI taskers and domain experts across many different types of disciplines. So why is human feedback in AI application development even required? As these systems become more sophisticated, evaluating also becomes more complex. There are traditional metrics like accuracy, F1 scores, things like that, but they largely has become relatively insufficient. In your traditional machine learning world, where you had your classifiers and you had your annotators annotating certain images, and then you have a classifier to identify whether a certain object is in the image or not, these metrics make sense. But in today's world, where models have become a lot more complex, human feedback also has become a lot more complex. Why? Well, because they don't capture the user experience, satisfaction, or even alignment with our human values in most cases. The most technically impressive AI can still fail if it doesn't actually meet the user needs or expectations. And this sort of creates a bit of a gap in the evaluation that only human feedback at the moment can fill. Of course, these models will become more sophisticated, and also the need for human feedback will shift, and this is then for us to determine and to work through. So if you think about the whole AI development lifecycle, it actually has evolved quite a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. When I first started in the AI world, more than a decade ago now, traditional machine learning was more on the cards. Your traditional supervised learning, where you have your labels, your annotations, things like that. That's where human data was actually a big factor, largely for training models, right? So if you annotate something, you label something, and then you train against that label. But today, these annotation tasks are actually quite different. It's not like everybody can just label an image. You often need much more specific experts for very specific use cases. Today, we find that the role of human data is much more nuanced and focused around high quality data that not just can be done by anyone, but actually require domain experts. So we find that things are shifting towards more fine-tuning use cases, either very specific around very specific tasks or domains, but also evaluating AI systems, either whether they do quite well on specific tasks, or also whether they're safe or aligned, or whether they actually cover real life tasks. Human data is both useful at scale for scaled reviews, so where you have a lot of the same repeated tasks like annotation and labeling, but also quite useful when you want to do some one-off research while you're in the process of designing and validating your AI applications. We find actually that most model builders today, they focus largely on your sort of verifiable outcomes, right? Like coding or math challenges. You've seen this with the O series model at ChatGPT. They largely verified these things around a coding or a math challenge where you have a very specific output where you can programmatically check whether the output the model generated was factually correct or aligned with the output. However, these types of outputs that is quite limited around coding and math, the spectrum is a bit larger, and not all of them are directly verifiable. So human input is required also when you want to cover these less verifiable scope of information. For example, the humanities disciplines or law or medicine, psychology, and so on are a bit more difficult to capture at the moment and often require some form of human in the loop. It also becomes quite interesting when we talk about preference data and like having humans compare multiple AI outputs to determine which one is better. You've seen this with LM Arena or similar benchmarks, or focusing on quality ratings, like scoring AI outputs on specific dimensions, like how accurate something it is, or how helpful or how safe something is. Identifying actual errors, like factual inconsistencies, hallucinations, or straight up problematic content often is quite important before you put out a model into the wild. But also just in your traditional development process, things like usability testing, evaluating how people interact with and experience the AI that you interface with them. And lastly, it's also worth to consider very diverse perspectives, ensuring that the AI works well across a lot of different demographics and use cases or different user bases. And this is where Prolific really shines, given the breadth of the amount of people we have on the platform. You can sort of mimic and emulate the user bases or this diversity quite well. One very prominent example of the impact of human feedback is RLHF. Probably most of you have heard about it by now. It's reinforcement learning from human feedback. It really has transformed how we think about language models, or now also larger foundational models. The process is simple. You generate a couple of outputs, usually two, and then you have a human rate one over the other. It actually doesn't say which one is the best. It just demonstrates which one is better. But this comparative example, this comparative input, actually allows to go from something that without RLHF, the models are actually not doing that well. It tunes the model into something that is much more aligned with what we would expect from like with our human preferences and our expectations from the human side. So this is one example, and we see this in a lot of different use cases where this human in the loop impacts the output of these models quite significantly. You might also find today, when comparing models or assessing their aptitude for specific tasks, you've probably seen like very widespread evaluation metrics or several leaderboards like LM Arena and all of these different ones. They're ranking all these models for different capabilities, right? It's useful to compare these models across like these standardized axes for sure, but it might not always translate to more specific use cases. For example, it's like GPT 4.5 that came out recently. It actually scores very low on hallucination rates. I think it's even the lowest one. But there are several reports that it's actually heavily hallucinating on very specific domains and use cases. So overall, it might look like it's not hallucinating, but you sometimes need to measure something much more specifically depending on what your use case is. So involving humans to assess the more specialized use cases can be a very good and quick way to validate and evaluate a model effectiveness, and it gives you more control over what is being evaluated. You can mimic your user base or use domain experts for fine-tuned models in a specific domain, and this is where Prolific can also help you. More specifically, what we do focus on at Prolific is we support this very significant increase that we've seen from AI companies using our platform predominantly for the evaluation portion, not to create human data for training or fine-tuning, but specifically to evaluate and safety test different AI applications. Why does it matter for them? Well, one, we have a very diverse participant pool. So the access to participants across different demographics, expertises, and backgrounds actually matters for a lot of them. The speed and scale also matters. So we have the ability to collect thousands of judgments very rapidly within hours often, We also have relatively tight quality controls, the features that ensure high quality and whether people are attentive and consistent in their responses. And one thing that is very dear to us because of our background in academic research is our ethical focus. In research, you cannot publish anything if you do not describe or back up where you have sourced your data from, and we translate that to the company. All right, let's focus on a couple of sort of best practices, if you will. There are a couple of things that you should always think about when using human feedback in the development of your AI applications. So one is the most important one. You need to define very strict evaluation criteria. You need to be very thoughtful and very concrete about what is it that you need to measure, and what does good look like for your application, because there is technically you can ask anything and everyone, but if you're not specific about what you want to measure, you're not gonna end up with the data that you think. The other one is be very thoughtful about the tasks that you create. So you want tasks that elicit meaningful feedback without biasing the results. So one drawback that I have seen commonly is, especially when you think of tasks in multiple languages, be careful when you, for example, just translate an instruction set into another language. You could consider also running user interviews ahead of time to speak to people in those languages, in those localities, to ensure that they're interpreting the instructions in the intended way. Because otherwise you're introducing biases just by the fact that you translated something from English. You should also consider maybe more specialized evaluators. We have over 300 different types of filters on Prolific, so you can be very, very specific about who do you need in your population. And but at the same time, if you're too specific, you're lacking a certain level of diversity. So from my own experience, even if you build out a very objective annotation, you still can find a lot of subjective variation in the responses. So if it's very important to you that you get the right responses, consider actually re-reviewing a couple of these and measure the variance that you get between different raters. Often it matters who you're getting in there. Even if you get a very specific set of domain experts, it can still matter that you have a diverse set within the set of the domain experts to mitigate that. Also, iterate heavily and rapidly. With the speed of Prolific, you can actually use it throughout your development process. Use human feedback not as an afterthought or something to do after the fact. Use it sporadically throughout. Really build alongside with it. Consider whether you need batched human input for development and research, or whether you can build something directly into your production applications via our APIs. Also consider whether you always need sort of a scale output, or whether you need like a qualitative output or quantitative output, or even open-ended feedback to learn some of the argumentation of what some of the participants taking your data collection tasks are thinking about. And very lastly, this is very dear to all of us, respect participant well-being. This is very important especially when you deal with something more sensitive or potentially harmful content. To sum up, AI capabilities advance quite rapidly, and interestingly enough, we're seeing more human evaluation becoming more critical and not less. We're also seeing a lot of growing interest in constitutional AI type approaches where human values explicitly guide development. The future of AI evaluation will likely involve specialized evaluation frameworks for a lot of different type of applications, and probably a lot of them we haven't discovered yet. At Prolific, we're constantly developing new capabilities to support all of you to build more sophisticated evaluation and AI applications. In conclusion, human feedback isn't just a nice to have. It's actually essential for building AI that people actually want to use and are rooted in real life tasks and real life applications that broader leaderboards sometimes cannot capture. I'll pass it back to Adam to take you through one of our products, the AI Task Builder, which is our own data collection tool.
Fab. Thank you, Enzo. Fantastic. That was great to hear. And now I'll be able to show one of many examples that we probably have of this and how this works end to end on the Prolific platform. So I'm just going to share my screen. So as I mentioned, this is just one example, and this is the type of task that Enzo's been talking about, where we would look for really specific domain experts, and actually you need a level of expertise to be able to evaluate the output of the AI model. And in this case, we're talking about evaluating the output from an AI powered medical research assistant. So it looks through medical journals that are published and actually summarizes or analyzes the content of them. And the goal here is really a task that we refer to as factuality. So it's essentially assessing the accuracy of that model it's summarizing, and avoiding it having hallucinations or rooting those out. So I'm going to start by showing you how you would create that initial data set. And this is the format that we look for the data set to be in, to upload to Prolific, to AI Task Builder, to then render your task, your evaluation task in the platform. So I'm going to show you this example data set here. So as you can see, it's just a simple CSV file. The first row becomes the titles of the containers where your text is shown to a participant. And then each row underneath that becomes an individual task. So if I work my way along from left to right in that first row, you've essentially got a number of different points that are context of the original medical journal. So in this case, it was the name, the question it was in response to, the results, and then the conclusion and relevance. And the part that's really important here is that in column F here, we've got the LLM summary. So this is what I mentioned is the part that our participants are going to be evaluating, is how effectively or how accurately did that summarize the content from that medical journal. Now that I've shown you this data set, I'm going to show you how that would then look once you start to upload that into AI Task Builder. So I'm going to show you that just now. So I'm going to go on to here. This, for those of you who are already Prolific customers, this probably looks very familiar. If you're new, this will be what you see once you're signed in to the platform. And you've got AI Task Builder here, or you can access it from the menu at the left-hand side. So when I click into that, I can then create a new batch. A batch is what we class as your data set paired with the tasks that you configure. So I'm going to then click create a new batch because I want to upload that data set that I've just shown, and then create my tasks around that. I'm going to give my task a name, so evaluating the factuality of AI generated summaries, and then I'm going to upload my CSV file here. So you can see that's uploaded. When I go through to the next step, the system's looking for me to input a name and a description. And this is so that it shows to participants so that they know what they're going to be taking part in if they take part in your task. So this really is like a high level introduction that almost is the thing that allows a participant to decide whether or not they are capable of want to take part in the task. And actually they'll see that on their dashboard. Underneath that is the place where we can add much more detailed instructions. Now, I've not added a huge amount of detail here. It's just an example, but actually you can add lots of detail here so that participant can understand exactly how you expect them to take part in the task, any context or information that they might need. And the great thing about this is they can access this. They see it when they first come in to start the task, but they also can access it at any point throughout the task. So it means if they need a reminder of any definitions or context, it's available to them anytime. What I'm going to take you through now is adding the actual specific annotation instructions to your data set. So if you remember that CSV file I showed you, this is then how it renders within the system. So what I've got here is each of my data points that I saw in the rows of my CSV, and I've got that first row as an example on the left hand side here where I've got the context from that medical journal, and then I've got the LLM summary down here, and that's the part that will be evaluated. So at that stage, I'm then going to add my evaluation instructions for the participant. So I'm going to ask, choose from different formats that those inputs can come in. In this case, I want to define specific multiple choice that they can select from, but I also want them to then explain their selection. So I'm going to choose multiple selection with free text, and I'm going to add that. I'm going to then explain what they need to be evaluating, so the accuracy according to the original journal excerpts. And I'm going to also define each of the answers that are available. So as you can see here, I've got a number of different options. So inaccurate, unsupported, disputed, and I can continue to add them until I'm satisfied I've got all of the variations that I want the participant to select from in the multiple choice. In addition, as I mentioned, I want them, the participants, to explain a little bit about why they've made their selection. So what will also happen is they will be able to then put in the free text to say exactly why they chose that. And I'm just going to put a bit of a prompt for them to say, please explain your rating. Once I've configured that, and in this case, if I wanted to, I could go in and add secondary, third, as many questions as I wanted to ask them in terms of evaluating that. In this case, I'm going to ask that one primary question. And now that I've done that, I want to preview it as a participant just to check how that looks. And what you can see here is, again, you've got the data point on the left-hand side that the participant's going to be evaluating. And on the right-hand side is going to be the options that they will select from. And if, as in this preview, I selected unsupported, then what pops out is a free text box to say, please explain your rating, so that I can gather more insight from that participant about why they've chosen that option. As I mentioned before, if at any point the participant has forgotten some of the initial instructions you gave or the context, they can access it anytime just by clicking See Task Details button. Because this is just a preview for me as the researcher who's configuring this, I'm going to go back to my template, and I'm actually satisfied now that I'm ready to publish. I do have the option to save the template if I wanted to come back to it later, but at this part what I want to do is actually publish that out to prolific participants to take part in the task. So I'm going to click Save and Set Up Study. Before I do that, the system's looking for me to define how many of those data points that I've just, and tasks that I've configured, how many of those a participant can take as part of a single submission. This is really relevant for much larger data sets, which is much more, it is really what we're seeing being uploaded onto the system, and it's so that you can batch that up so that many of your data points can be annotated in parallel. In this case, I've just got four data points because it's just an example, so I'm just going to allow each participant to annotate one of those. This next step that I'm going to take you on to is really the part where you can see the huge value of getting the speed of data, but from the exact type of annotators or evaluators that you want, which is finding the right participants on Prolific. So this next part will look very familiar to those of you who have used Prolific in the past, which is actually the page where you would typically publish any tasks on Prolific. So I've already configured my task, as you've just seen. Some of that information is pulled through onto here, so that's copied across just to show the same description, the same name. I would just give it an internal name, which is this part here, so for my own records, when I go back to refer to that, I can see when I published it, and if I've got different iterations, I can see them listed with my own sort of name for that task. I'm going to flag this as annotation because I want participants to know that's the type of task that they're going to be taking. I'm also going to flag all countries available, as you just saw there, because I don't actually mind any sort of geographical specification. I could have selected, UK, US, whatever, so that I can specify if it's, maybe if it's relevant to a specific area. And this is the part where I'm going to add screeners. Now, as I showed at the beginning, the content that was being evaluated was very specific to the medical domain, and it really required someone who understood how to sort of read and assess that sort of medical journal or medical papers. So with that in mind, the domain experts that I need are individuals who have had a certain level of education, just because that would give them the experience with reading that sort of content and assessing it. So I'm going to put in that it needs to be someone who's got a graduate or a PhD. And I'm going to apply that. And what I can see is, even with that filter in place, I've got 53,000 or over 53,000 available active participants on Prolific. So I then want to drill down even further, because I don't just want those that have had that sort of degree or PhD. I want those that have actually got that in the health and medicine domain. So I'm going to again apply that second filter, and what I can see is I've got over 1,000 participants still available, even though I've narrowed that down to that sort of very specific category. So that's great news for me, because I know that I've got lots of people available to annotate the data set that I've just uploaded. So with that in mind, the final step is I'm just going to define an estimate of how long it takes to complete that task, and actually then define how much I'm going to pay the participant. As Enzo mentioned, it's really important for us the well-being and fair pay of the participants on Prolific. So we put a recommended pay on there, but you as the data collector can define exactly how much that is. Then I can see a summary of how much it's going to cost, and then I can actually publish that task. So the final thing I'm going to show you here is this is essentially the submissions page. So once I've published that task, I can literally watch as the submissions start to roll in, and this will happen minutes after publishing. In a second, I'll show you the data set that I published. So yeah, we want to review those submissions and then see the data, the evaluations that have been submitted as part of those. So this here is that same page that I showed before, but it's the page where the submissions have already come in. And this would start to fill up as they were active, and then actually as they go through to complete. So you can watch that happening in real time. And this is really the thing our customers think of as like the moment where they see the huge value of Prolific, is that data starts coming in minutes. You're not talking about hours or days. It's minutes that the data starts flowing in, and it really makes the ability to collect high quality data super fast. Now, although I was only collecting four submissions here, so not the scale that we're used to, much smaller. As you can see, it took less than 10 minutes to collect these, and that was from those really specific domain experts that I specified. So it shows you how quickly, so even if I was publishing 400 or 4,000 data points, those could be annotated also within minutes. It's not going to take a long time to fill those. And then what I want to do is I want to download my task responses. So this is the part where I want to get my evaluations of that model output. And this is the final thing I'm going to show you today. So let's actually review that output data set. So you've got a lot of information here. So things like submission ID, study ID, time sample when it was completed. In column H, you've got the task ID, which is what I had specified in my original data set. It allows me to keep a track of actually which data point the annotation was for, and connect that back. And then I've also got the selection that the participants who evaluated the model outputs gave for each of those LLM summaries. So essentially, the majority of these are telling me that it was accurate, and one of them is disputed. What this gives me is, imagine this was a much larger data set with many more evaluations, what I can then see is I can use that to sense check how well my model is doing in a particular area. So in this case, it was evaluated on accuracy. So I can determine how accurate is the model, and at summarizing those medical journals, and also I can identify is it hallucinating, is there inaccuracies. And again, the great thing about having the explanation there as well is you've got those domain experts giving an explanation as exactly why they've maybe selected that. So in this case, this participant is selected disputed, and the flagged that it didn't explicitly say that it was implemented in 2014. So again, it's calling out exactly where the inaccuracies were, so that I can then determine if there are hallucinations there. Enzo mentioned about doing this in an iterative way, and this is exactly what we've seen customers use in this end-to-end process for it, is that they may run a very similar process a number of times, and what we would hope to see is that sort of column I, where you're looking at the evaluation, you would expect to see that improve over time as the model was improved, and maybe some of those hallucinations, or it's the model's tendency to produce inaccurate information starts to be eliminated. And that's the sort of the great thing about this process, is you can see that improvement over time, and also then it can give you confidence to deploy the AI application that you've built with that confidence of the expert human feedback behind it. Yeah, fantastic. So that hopefully gives you an idea. There's loads of other use cases that we're seeing in our platform at the moment. Some really exciting stuff in AI development of loads of different domains, and it's great to see our participants helping to contribute to that. I think we are now going to move on to Q&A, which I believe Sabrina is going to help out with. Fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. So we've had a few questions come through the chat. If anybody has any other questions, now's the time to put them in the chat. Just starting with this first one. For our teams just starting out with human evaluations, would it make sense to start with quantitative ratings first?
I can take this. Yeah, it would make sense because it makes it much more easy to measure and aggregate and turn this into a useful statistic for you. If you start out with something qualitative, you have to, yeah, it's just the post-processing of it is much more difficult. However, you only get the biggest value if you understand the quantitative measures that you're actually focusing on measuring here. So it does sometimes make sense to do some qualitative research, one-off research, to understand that you are setting the right tasks, you're formulating the instructions well, you're sense checking it, so to speak, with a very small amount of user interviews or a few people. And then you launch things at higher scale once you know that you're asking the right questions, and those can be then quantitative.
Excellent. We have a question here from Desi, which says, how do we know participants aren't just using AI in these evaluations?
Yeah, great question. So we've got a number of different things that we do to ensure that high quality data is coming from human participants. What we are just on the cusp of launching is LLM detection within our own tool and solution that I showed today, and as well as integrated within some third-party survey or data collection tools, which is great for us because it allows us to really even further enhance that really high quality data that you get on Prolific. So we're very excited to launch that. Watch the space. It's coming out in a couple of weeks time at the most.
Okay, last question in the chat. I've got one more. It says, when setting up evaluations, is there a recommended number of tasks or data points we should set per annotator?
I think we typically sort of recommend trying to keep tasks under an hour or so, just for the sake of making sure a participant can maintain focus, especially if it's quite a heavy or data intensive task. So it's a case of estimating that. We've seen anything from like just a few data points being published to maybe 50, 60 different data points. Very like dependent on how heavy the task is. So some of the evaluations that are done on Prolific maybe are just evaluating a sentence. It's as simple as that. And again, they can be fired through quite quickly, whereas some, like the one I showed today, requires a lot more reading. So you might want to reduce how many tasks. It's probably just up to each individual task and assessing the sort of cognitive load on the annotator to make sure that they're able to give the best possible evaluation.
I can also add something to that. Think about it from a diversity perspective. If let's say you have 100 tasks, they might take each a couple of minutes. If you have a single person answering them, you might get your data quite quickly, but it might bring the potential of being biased towards that one person. So there is a trade-off between someone taking many tasks, they become experts at it, they're very familiar with your instruction set. That's great. But at the same time also try to like broaden it a little bit and think about what is the breadth and the distribution of people that you require.
Very good point. In that time, we've had one last question come through. It says, can I publish tasks in other languages?
Yes, you can indeed. So tasks in other languages, we've had a number of different tasks published recently, a few in Spanish and some in Hindi, just to evaluate different content in different languages. So that's absolutely possible. We've also got many of the native speakers of those languages on Prolific, so you can find individuals who will be able to effectively annotate that information and take part in that task.
Amazing. And that is all of our questions. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Enzo. And thank you for joining us.